Speaker.
Call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would agree with the previous speaker on one point. He made that the bill had come out of Select Committee in somewhat better shape than it went in. However, the Greens initially supported this legislation to Select Committee with some reservations because I guess sex offending against children is universally abhorred. It is one of the most offensive forms of criminal activity possible. There has been talk of registers, their merits or not, for over some time. So we went into that process with an open mind to investigate the evidence, to see, in fact, if there is value in establishing something like a child sex offender register in New Zealand. Our conclusion is, sir, that there is no value in that proposition. We will not be supporting this bill in future readings. And we're basing that on the evidence we heard at Select Committee. And it was a good committee, and there's one or two changes made that have improved the bill from the initial draft. But overall, we simply don't see that there will be a sufficient return on investment, if you like, and I mean that in a general, not only an economic sense, on establishing something like this. There is overall a distinct lack of evidence that these registers actually do anything to make our children safer. There is a lot of economic and other costs along the way. The bill, as it's drafted, proposes an incredibly intrusive regime for people who may indeed have offended. We are concerned, obviously, the Section 7, the Bill of Rights Act report. The concerns outlined in that Section 7 report still stand. The bill does impose disproportionate punishment. And yes, I acknowledge that there is now the possibility that after 15 years, a person might apply to have their name removed from that bill. That is a small step, but still overall, the punishment, if you like, is disproportionate. I mentioned the intrusive nature, everything down to people's log-ons and passwords for their internet accounts, email accounts and the like, would be open to inspection by all and sundry, and I do mean that, a point I'll come back to in a moment. So the Human Rights Commission was one of those who noted that the bill would be very costly. The RIS document, the figures given us by the officials, indicate a cost of about $146 million over 10 years. And on balance, it's very hard to see how simply creating a list of names is going to give better value for $146 million over that period than would investment in such things as education programs, educating families and their children on how to keep our kids safe, treatment programs, and despite some assertions to the contrary, sex offenders can be rehabilitated. They can and often do change their behaviours. So investing $146 million in essentially creating a list of names with potential for significant negative knock-on effects, we simply don't see as a smart way to spend scarce public sector dollars. The Council for Civil Liberties agrees with that point of view. They described the bill as establishing a very harsh regime with very little justification while making no economic sense. The Law Society similarly expressed the view that the bill infringes on civil rights and freedoms, and it made a positive alternative proposition that the very admirable intent of the bill, which is to improve the safety of our children from potential offending of this sort, could be achieved by allowing judges and indeed parole boards to impose a registration and reporting requirement in individual cases where the risk profile is seen as being so high that such a regime would be appropriate. And I think that would be a much, much better proposition, a much more targeted proposition, a more effective and appropriate proposition than this sort of shotgun, this blanket approach that simply registers people for an offence and in many cases puts them on that list for life. So I mentioned that the Select Committee had made some changes that we saw as being positive, but not sufficient to make this legislation overall acceptable to us. The legislation names a number of agencies who would have access to the register. They include police and corrections, and that would seem entirely appropriate. And both of those organisations are accustomed to routinely dealing with confidential information, confidential databases, if you like. Then we get down to the Ministry for Social Development. I'm not sure how many people work for MSD, but I suspect it's a large number. And the likelihood, sorry? 10,100, thank you, Mr. Naro, a man on top of his numbers, clearly. That is a large number of people we would be relying on to keep our database confidential. Similarly, Housing New Zealand. People in that organisation, I suspect, have no particular culture or experience in maintaining very strict confidentiality of highly sensitive database information, material, whatever you call it. I think my point being, of course, that you would have many, many thousands of people, in fact, with access to this database. The likelihood of its leaking, it's almost a certainty that all or part of that database, of that register, would quite quickly enter the public domain. The knock-on effect of that, we know, could be entirely negative. It could lead to what somebody last night referred to as vigilante action against people. We know from the evidence we saw at the Select Committee that, for want of a better word, outing people publicly, drawing attention to people who may be back in the community and trying to live proper and decent lives, drawing attention to them, making them the target of suspicion and fear and often aggression is more likely to lead to them reoffending than if they are simply left to get on with their lives with appropriate positive support from within the community. Again, we would be much better to restore and dramatically increase funding to projects like the Circles of Support and Accountability. We saw the Bond Trust recently, who have a good record of working with pedophiles post-release and ensuring that they are protected, in some cases from themselves, and that other people are protected from them. Doing that in a very positive, low-key way. That funding, that, dare I say, a trivial amount of $25,000 has been withdrawn, despite the fact that in UK, as we speak, the funding for similar entities has been dramatically ramped up because it's proven to lower the likelihood of people reoffending, of sex offenders specifically reoffending. So you've got to pose the question, why are we spending millions of dollars, many millions, $146 million over 10 years on a project that's unlikely to result in improving the safety of our children when we are taking away small amounts of money from a project that has a track record of protecting those self-same children. So something that sits behind this, this legislation, I believe, and we saw it spelt out very graphically in some submissions, is the proposition that sex offenders cannot be rehabilitated, cannot cease their behaviours. That is simply patently untrue, and we have good evidence that, in fact, there are many examples where people have offended against children, but then have gone on to regret their actions, to seek treatment and to remove themselves from that risk profile. So there is no evidence to suggest, no solid evidence to say that a register will deliver the outcomes that it seeks to achieve. We know there are alternative mechanisms for reducing the risk of offenders that certain offenders represent. I recently had a conversation with a fellow who works in this area as a support person for some serious and high-risk sex offenders, and they know very well what does work and what can work. And all along, at every step, they're running against bureaucratic and economic barriers to fulfilling, to implementing the programs that we know do work. So I think while this is certainly well-intentioned legislation, anything that protects our kids from predators, from sex offenders, has got to be seen as a good thing. But so we have absolutely no confidence that this legislation will deliver positive outcomes, and for that reason we'll not be supporting it.
Mr. Speaker.